Yeah, there you
Perfect.
go. How do you call that? Because I know about the manual. How do you call it?
Do people
In this
start?
This is the.
I do. Okay. Do people want to put their headphones on and we'll make a start? Headphones.
Now the headphones. Not playing. I know. I've seen it. Now yeah.
Oh, and now people are leaving that we're starting. Welcome. Delighted to have everybody here for this session on the real economy and climate resilience. Is the real economy driving action, or is the real economy free riding? My name's Amy Barnes. I lead climate sustainability at Marsh, part of Marsh McLennan, and I'm delighted to be joined on stage by Cara Williams, who's the Global ESG and Sustainability Leader at Mercer, Roberto Sifon, Global Head of Sovereign and Multilateral Development Ratings at S&P Global, and Svenja Szyminski, Managing Director, Climate and Sustainability for Marsh McLennan. Welcome and thank you. And I've just seen one of our other panelists arrive. Excuse me. I'm additionally delighted to be joined by Rob Cameron, Head of ESG Engagement at Nestlé. Welcome. So I'm going to start off with just a bit of scene setting about resilience and then hand over to our panel. If you wouldn't mind putting the first slide up, please. The slide that's about to appear, dun dun dun, is the framework that we use to think about resilience. And I think this is important as we think about the real economy and commercial players. We think about resilience, first of all, at the asset level, and that's where a lot of corporates start. They start thinking about the resilience of their assets, and then that very quickly becomes operations and people. Can their people still work in the way they've always worked? Will they be available to work? Do they need to change their operations and maintenance? Will inspection regimes have to change because of temperature extremes and the way that people operate? But really important, you'll also see emergency response. Oh, so could you go to the prior slide, please? You'll also see emergency response. One of the things that corporates aren't necessarily thinking about is, will they be able to respond to emergencies in the way that they have previously in a climate change scenario? So, for example, many industrial facilities rely on locally sourced fire water. In a fire in 2030 and 2035, will that water still be available for containing a fire that may have nothing to do with the climate outcome? But that's just the issues that our clients need to think about at an asset level. They operate within a much wider system, and this is where we come to the issue of free riders and our corporates doing enough. So within the wider system, corporates are relying on often extensive supply chains that go far beyond their tier one companies that they may have a relationship to the tier two, tier three, and we'll hear some of the work that Rob's been doing with his supply chain in Nestlé. They're dependent on critical infrastructure. There's been a huge amount in the press about drought in our waterways and the impacts that that's had on global shipping, not being able to transport goods in the way that were expected or in the routes that were expected. But we also have very thermally fragile infrastructure. Our railway lines are thermally fragile, our roads are, as are our transmission and distribution lines. We need to think about the resilience of our ecosystem services. So, for example, a drinks manufacturer, will they still have access to water? Manufacturing facilities, do they have similar access? Communities, capital providers, and in capital providers I'm including insurers. Now Marsh, we're the world's largest risk and insurance broker, and we recognise that insurance forms both part of people's resilience, it provides the financial resilience that people need, but you also need to be resilient in order to buy insurance. That insurance is only there if you're able to demonstrate that the risk is well managed. So that's the framework that we use to think about resilience. If we could pop onto the next slide, then I'll just talk about a survey that we conducted earlier in the year with global corporates to see the extent to which they were assessing those risks. So some high-level numbers. 50% of the participants who responded had experienced extreme weather events in the past 3 years. Now, the reason that's so significant is I promise you insurers are not expecting that frequency of losses. Again, of the population, 45% have suffered financial loss as a result of extreme weather. 72% of our respondents said that they're now contemplating climate resilience in their risk management plans, but only 29% of companies are looking at their resilience beyond the site level. Only 29%, one-third of companies are actually thinking about resilience outside of their owned assets and into that wider infrastructure. So this is a graphic on the slide that you can see now that shows that adaptation framework overlaid with some of the survey results you can see. And you can see that much higher density of respondents thinking about resilience at their own site level. Very, very little research being done on resources and ecosystem services. One of the statistics I probably quote most frequently is around the use of water, and that in Taiwan, the government has been paying farmers for the past 3 years not to plant rice so there is enough water to make semiconductors. And I don't think many companies are thinking about the vulnerability to water in high-tech industries. So we can see a real gap in the resilience assessments that corporates are making. But please feel free to use the QR code to get the full details of that survey. But companies are taking action. As I said, 72% of the companies that we surveyed are thinking about resilience, and so we want to look at the work that they're doing and the work that they need to do. So first of all, I'm going to hand over, if I may, to Rob from Nestlé to talk about some of the work that you've been doing in your supply chain and beyond on resilience. Over to you.
Yeah. Yes, glad to. Thank you for that. One of the things to say about Nestlé is that we, like many businesses, we have shareholders, and we have to answer to those shareholders, and we have to do that day by day by day by day. But there's another fundamental truth, which is that we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural world, because we depend upon nature for everything that we do. All of the ingredients that go into the foods that we make, it's all from agriculture, and agriculture, of course, is, by its very nature, part of nature. Now, we see what's going on in the world right now. Yesterday, Susanna Mohammed is now here. 2 weeks ago, I was in Colombia. This is one of the most important sources of really high quality coffee. Since we left Colombia for CBD 16, there's been the most disastrous flooding. While we sit here today, the cleanup operation in Spain, where we grow a lot of tomatoes, is still going on. What you may not know, we don't have Chad as a particular country of origin for our ingredients, but while the world has been looking at Spain and looking at Colombia and looking at Hurricane Helene, Chad has been experiencing disastrous flooding as well. 340 lives lost, and countless cattle, which will lead to not only a humanitarian crisis, but a food crisis, a food resiliency crisis. So we're seeing climate change all around us as a lived experience. As a company that depends upon the natural world and upon agriculture, we've been working on our climate impacts since, well, for many, many years. The Net Zero Roadmap in 2020 was the great shift forward. And because of the dependency on agriculture, our emissions, Scope 3, constitute over 90% of the overall emissions total. What that means is we have to change the way we farm, fundamentally change the way we farm. And that's the big pivot that we're making to regenerative agriculture, a form of farming that can enhance biodiversity, that can protect standing forests, enhance tree planting with agroforestry, silvopasture, etc. One of the interesting things about the pivot to regenerative agriculture is that it's not only mitigating our climate impacts, it's enhancing resilience. These are the very steps that we would want to take to enable farmers upon whom we depend to be able to continue farming in the face of flooding, extreme heat, and so on and so forth. So this combination of a mitigation play on the one hand adaptation on the other is what will lead to, and when we're talking, going back to my earlier point about shareholders want to know why we're spending money on this and that and the other. The answer is, it's a source of competitive advantage if you have a resilient value chain. That's the internal narrative that enables us to be able to invest the scale of the funding that we are investing into this. It's a resilient value chain. And I think, when we look, what we're worried about, to your point about free riders, is the fact that not everybody is playing in this space. And we need to unlock the funding so that it's not dependent on a handful of companies like Nestle or Danone or PepsiCo, Unilever, Diageo would be another one. These are players that are all committed to the same thing. We're all trying to do the same thing. We all want resilient value chains, but we need to make sure that the funding is there so that the free riders who simply transfer, they're buying commodities from here, we'll buy it over there. It's exactly the same as we had with outsourcing in globalization, where you chase down into Asia, then you chase down into China, and then chase down into India, and all you end up doing is moving your manufacturing around, driving down prices. In fact, what we want to do is enhance resilience in all sources, in all operations.
That's so good to hear, and I think that the point that you have is that you've made is there's actually very little incentive to be a first mover sometimes, that there's an incentive also to be fast follow.
The incentive is there if you have a long-term perspective, and Nestlé's always had this position of creating shared value, create value for the societies in which you operate at the same time as you're creating value for shareholders. So we take this company that's been around for 170 years now. We do tend to take a long-term view, but I would argue that there is indeed, as you put it, a first-mover competitive disadvantage in the near term, in the expectation of an advantage in the long term. But that we would unlock so much more action if we could either raise the bar or increase the flow of funding. One of the other things I'm often fond of saying is that if Nestlé invests $50 million in a new factory, we can put that on the balance sheet. We capitalize the asset. It doesn't terribly much affect this year's profitability. If we invest 500,000 Swiss francs in supporting some regenerative agricultural transitions that will enhance tree planting, for instance, or improve soil health, improve biodiversity, the payback period for that will be over the next 10, 15 years in terms of impact, but the cash comes out of this year's P&L, this year's profit and loss account. So we're investing in infrastructure for our future, but we can't capitalize the asset. Imagine what we could do if that accounting rule was to be different and we could capitalize the asset. If you can put nature on the balance sheet, make it a bankable asset, that you've got a just transition just standing there waiting to happen.
I think that's a fantastic point about how we accelerate corporate action. The observant among you may have noticed a quick change in our panel lineup. We are delighted to have the Honourable Wade Crowfoot. We didn't know if you could join us, so we're delighted that you managed to come. You're the Secretary for California Natural Resources Agency. Having caught your breath, may I turn to you to talk about California's views and priorities, and I don't know how much of Rob's comments you managed to capture, just some of the things that corporates need to make the action that they desperately want to take easier. So no pressure.
Well, thank you. And so sorry I'm late. I mixed my B with an E and it had me at the other end of the conference center. But in any event, it's great to be together with you. From our view in California, as we look globally, we need to strengthen partnerships between private investment, corporates, and government. At the end of the day, we're really proud of what we're doing in California. We believe we're investing really an unprecedented amount of our public funding in climate action. But even if we take that across the world, I don't think it's going to be enough. So the question is, how do we, in government, set policy and support the type of corporate leadership that we need? We are living, and some of us thriving amidst a global capitalism, framework. And if we don't actually enable that framework to actually invest in the climate action we need and the biodiversity protection we need, we're all in big trouble. So in California, our goal is to set high ambition and then put policy in place that's actually going to drive us toward that. And I'm really proud of our progress. We're a large state. Measured by GDP, we're actually the 5th largest economy in the world. And we've set a legally binding requirement to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, as well as 100% renewable energy. And so we have certain systems in place, including a cap and trade system, what's called a low carbon fuel standard to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, in investment in commercializing technology. So I'm excited about what we've been able to achieve, 61% clean energy. We've reduced our carbon emissions. We met our 2020 goal. But I'm also excited to learn from the panelists here today about, from your perspective, what we should be doing in government to actually incentivize corporate leadership and the kind of investment we need.
I think you may be accepted on that challenge, certainly from Rob. You talked about tech industry, you talked about renewables. Can you talk a bit about what you're doing for agriculture? Because California is a massive agriculture state, and it's a key part of Rob's supply chain and underpins not just supply chains, but also income inequality.
Yeah, I think traditionally, a lot of our climate action within government has sort of left agriculture out of the equation. We focus so much on renewable energy or transportation or buildings. And the fact is, we need our natural systems to perform effectively, both to sequester carbon, to buffer us from climate impacts, and essentially to help us meet our goals. So our approach in California is agriculture needs to see itself in climate action, and we need to demonstrate the benefits of that. So I'll give you one example. So the sort of the broad approach is we're trying to incentivize agriculture and provide rewards for those entities that are investing in sustainable agriculture. We stood up a healthy soils program in California. We've capitalized it with at this point, about $100 million. And the idea is if you're a farmer and you are willing to put more organic content in your soil, we'll actually incentivize that. We'll subsidize that. The idea being we're trying to create an inflection point where more folks do that. Now, the benefit for the farmer is healthier soil, which is the most important asset you have, water retention in a Mediterranean climate like California, really important, but then also carbon sequestration. So we're trying to essentially bring along the early adopters. And then my magic wand is enable an ancillary funding source. So we have people in California that want to be carbon farmers. They want to produce a product, but also get an ancillary benefit for actually sequestering carbon. So that's sort of a big picture. But I would say we've done a lot, but we have a lot to learn from others.
Thank you for some really interesting case studies, and I'd like to come back to those. But before we do that, Roberto, can I come and talk to you about what you're seeing from sovereigns? We've heard from the real economy, we've heard from a government. How are you seeing the sovereigns and their investing priorities and the trade-offs they're making when it comes to resilience?
Great, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I was actually listening to what you were mentioning before, and that's really something that resonates quite a bit with what we observed. We rate 138 countries across the world, and of course, if you were mentioning some of the challenges that you might have in California, imagine what that means with the majority of the countries in the world, especially when you look at low and middle income countries that face a tremendous amount of pressures on, I think you were mentioning also some of these issues in Chad and some other countries, with a tenth or even less of the resources that you might have. And this is one of the key issues that we observe here is while the problem is, and this is something we've been talking with many in these days here, about 5 or 10 years ago, in most of our meetings with governments, the topic of climate, most of the time wouldn't even come up, right? Because we look at sovereign ratings from a credit perspective, and that was not an issue. Fast forward till today, it's on every single one of the discussions.
I have to interrupt you. What was that inflection point when it was silent to it now either being raised by the sovereigns or raised by S&P? Who started raising it, you or them, and why and when?
I think it was all of the above. I mean, and the inflection point was the pandemic. And actually, after the pandemic, we have a massive uptick on countries defaulting. And that put basically all these ingredients together, and when you look forward, how do you start solving these issues and the mountain of other problems that were coming? I think that all that situation really brought in, and of course the international community in general, right? I mean, this topic came has been taking a lot more speed, COP after COP. Let me put it that way. Now, the issue is that I want to highlight is one of the things we observe is priorities, and that's a big issue. The capacity to prioritize and still invest in everything you need that the United States or England or France or the Netherlands might have is not the same that Colombia, as I was being, I think you were mentioning earlier today, or the Philippines or Ghana would have. And I think that is a very substantial issue, because coming back to one of the topics of the panel, which is the private sector, if you don't have basic infrastructure figured out, basic adaptation done, basic investment done, there is only so much a corporate can do to adapt, right? If you have something like what we saw recently in Spain, regardless that you would have done a lot of adaptation for your business, I mean, basic infrastructure and basic spending is not done. So bottom line, the issue here is one of scarce resources, priorities, and it's not easy. And actually, the government alone cannot do it. And where it matters the most, even when you include MDBs, they cannot do it either, right? We're talking, any day you will hear 4, 5, 7 trillion of needs for investment in adaptation. MDBs mobilize 200 billion tops. How much can a government can invest in, an emerging market country can invest in capex on an average year? It's tiny. However, the issues around risk, be it exchange risk, institutional risk, those are very difficult to fix. I don't see them a lot in the discussion in forums like this. I think we're discussing a lot of things around it, but not, bottom line, the underlying weaknesses that many of these governments have, which is, if you have a complicated, not a very risky exchange rate where you will come in and invest, and you not only have to take the project risk, but also have to take the framework of operating that country risk. That's an issue that we still haven't figured out a solution, and it's really been an impediment for investment in adaptation, which in turn, I think we were discussing before, we at S&P, we made a study on the corporate side, and we did an assessment on about 7,000 companies across the world. Only 20% of those they actually have adaptation plans. And of those 20%, less than half have plans that have them investing in this adaptation over the next 10 years. So there's still a lot of homework to be done there to actually see this coming to a solid ground.
But I think one of the big challenges when we think about the systemic issues, I think it's very hard for the private sector to take action, because you have the free riders, we don't have a way of pricing externalities, we have the tragedy of the commons, and it's going to take some sort of organizing force to get over that dysfunction. And do you see, and I'm not trying to put an unfair question to you, but do you see any governments, any regulators trying to make it easy for the private sector to take more systems level action?
I think they're all trying to make it easier, but the problem is to change. Let me come back to the issue, that Colombia case, right? There is a lot of will and processes put in place to try to make it easier. But if you see what has happened recently, for example, with the resurgence of guerrilla, now you have about 15,000, again, guerrilla fighting that have about a third of the country under control of this. These things are so much more complex to fix, and they're not going to not be an impediment for investment. And it's not, as much as you as a government want to make it easier, the prioritization that you have to give to investment when you have an issue like this. And here is that one, and you could find many other topics in other parts of, especially where it really matters a lot today, or where it's not matter, but it was really much more needed because the impact is super strong, which is in emerging and frontier markets.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to people at the heart of the conversation, and ask Cara to talk about resilience of workforces. One of my favourite lines of yours that I'm going to steal is that, I know we're talking about resilience in this session, but Cara will often say that there is no transition without having the head of HR in the conversation, because if your workforce isn't transitioning, then your organisation won't. But rather than the transition, can you think about how you're seeing employers support their employees?
Yeah, thanks for that. I always feel a little bit like a non sequitur, which is odd when we're talking about climate and investment and supply chains, and somehow talking about people always feels like a, wait, what? It's a critical component, and when we look at corporations, yes, I do like to often say that no corporation is going to be able to transition unless they bring their people along that journey and make sure everyone's trained up. That's not the conversation for today. The conversation for today is very much focused on, I think we're talking about the inflection point, and we do see a lot of corporations sitting up and recognizing the fact that the increased cost of health benefits is enough for them to start thinking about their people and start thinking about how to realign their businesses in order to actually address those costs, right? So, I think Rob referred to shareholders. Corporations are driven by their shareholders, right? They have expectations that they have to deliver a return, and if you've got severe reduced productivity because your people can't work either because of health issues or because of temperatures, that actually is going to impact the bottom line. And so I'm always comfortable with saying it's okay to be cynical. It's okay to have companies behaving in certain ways because it's better for returns. And I do believe that the people agenda actually does help drive that a lot. Some things that we need to think about, and it is shocking how infrequently HR is included in the overall sustainability conversation. Very often, if a company does have a chief sustainability officer, HR is not included. They're not part of that journey. They're not part of the strategy. And it just doesn't make sense, because oftentimes you need to have somebody who actually has that lens when we're talking about business. So it's things like, if you're in an area that would say is more prone to things like wildfires, not only are your people going to be impacted by potential lung issues and things like that, but their children are going to be impacted by things like that, which means the kids can't necessarily go to school, thus meaning the parents probably can't go to school, and that directly leads to obviously a decrease in productivity and increased health costs. So we work with companies to help them try to design the benefits that are going to better cover their employees and their kids, and you have to do this with a direct climate lens, right? You can't just simply check boxes anymore. A lot of these organizations need to start thinking about that. And I know if you look at things like, we all saw, I think recently, that UPS has rolled out more air conditioning for their trucks. Obviously it has a negative impact on the climate, but it has a very definitive and clear importance when it comes to their people, their safety, and again, down to the productivity. So you're seeing, and if you look at the way that, let's say, a UPS operates their businesses, they down to the manager making a decision on whether or not they're going to add to their delivery fleet. The carbon footprint is actually part of the decision-making process, but so is the safety of their people, in making a decision as to whether or not they're going to have the air conditioning and whether or not it's going to be used and what times of days it's going to be used. So I think the climate impact on people is a critical component, and like I said, being cynical is kind of okay, because if it's going to help the bottom line, then that's going to help drive behaviors.
One of the case studies I really liked is in the US, a construction company called Turner's have just done a heat stress survey with a relatively small sample of employees, but they found that overwhelmingly during a heat stress event, employees were turning up to work dehydrated. So they're already, from a safety perspective, they're already compromised before they get to work. And so that's led to an intervention where they can give more hydration education, they can put more hydration statement, knowing that their workers are turning up in an unsafe state or and a potentially less productive state. Is really, it was a really simple learning from this study. And I think a lot of the things around for people, there are some relatively easy education interventions that employers can make, and it sounds like they're making them. But Rob, how do you do that in your supply chain? How do you think about the workers in your supply chain, not just those within within your direct control?
Yeah, so we have very clear guidance to all of our tier 1 suppliers, tier 2, tier 3 as well. So, and one of the things we've done is work really hard on training where we feel that training is needed with our suppliers to help them to understand the standards that we want them to work to. So we're very clear about how we drive this through the value chain. We have direct relationship with farmers, though. That's the thing that I think is often overlooked. The assumption is that Nestle's value chain, we buy from the big traders. We do. We buy from other manufacturers, yes. But actually, it's those 600,000 farmers that we work with directly that we feel, is an area where we really want to lean in, because we're at the farm gate. It's a Nestle person at the farm gate that's buying those commodities. And that's why it's
so Rob, how uncommon is that in your industry?
I think it is relatively uncommon, because there has been, in terms of global food companies, there's definitely been a consolidation. And the big traders, the ABCDs of this, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and the other one, his name escapes me, Age. They have a very, very strong hold on a lot of commodities. And one of the things that we talk about, it's really difficult to do this, but we depend on commodities, and we need to decommoditize commodities, because the inherent qualities of a coffee bean shade grown with a farmer that's paid a decent living income is a very different coffee bean in our eyes to a coffee bean that's traded and you've got no idea where it came from, what kind of labor and conditions was that coffee farmed in. And that decommoditization is really difficult to do, because you have to invest in traceability. That's where we've got a major program going on in cocoa to try and enhance the lives of cocoa farmers. And we're putting a lot of money in paying farmers for the outcomes that we seek. You talked just now about, we want farmers to invest in activities that improve soil organic matter, soil carbon. Absolutely, 100%, fully behind it. So in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, we're putting money into, are your kids in school? Point one. Are you engaging in good pruning practices that will improve the productivity of your trees? Good agroforestry and regenerative practices? And are you engaged in trying to find other forms of income in order to try and get more resilience in those communities? That costs a lot of money. But interestingly, or worryingly, the amount of money that it's costing us to improve the level of traceability so we can track those cocoa beans, that cocoa butter, that cocoa powder through into a finished Kit Kat, that's incredibly expensive because of the way the system is set up. So there's a really interesting challenge for global food companies pretty much everywhere to figure that traceability and transparency out. So the inherent, should we call it sustainability or resilience qualities of the bean or the whatever it is, the dairy, is there and recognized and can then be valued. That's and indeed, going back to public policy, I would argue that one of the problems we have is that the unsustainable commodities are typically cheaper. It should be that trade policy and tariffs makes those commodities more expensive and prices them out of the market and enhance. We shouldn't have to pay a premium for a cup of coffee that has got a decent livelihood at the farmer for the other end of it.
Secretary Crowfoot, do you get that?
I did, and the one word I keyed on is transparency and disclosure, and that's one thing we're working on in California, and it's a bit controversial with corporations, but the idea that companies need to actually disclose their carbon footprint and actually go to the sort of the third tier of impacts. And I think that there are some companies that are actively embracing that. There are other companies that are concerned about that. But to me, if we're going to actually reward and incentivize companies like Nestle that are working to do the right thing, we have to build transparency around all companies. I love the idea of rewarding good behavior, and I think part of that is creating transparency so that ultimately there's some differentiation. That if I know I'm buying a product from a company that's actually investing in its suppliers versus somebody that's not, it's just really hard to know that as a consumer or even as a regulator. So I do think that there's going to be a movement towards transparency, and I think if we On the other end, if we get better at markets and we get companies that are actually willing to make investments in carbon markets and biodiversity credits, they could meet, ultimately companies being, measured and maybe even regulated on their carbon footprint in a carbon-constrained world. But then there's mechanisms to actually that they can make investments to make the change we need.
Thank you. Roberto, can you see a time when S&P has it explicit in its methodology that some of these concepts around traceability, the resilience of certainly in emerging markets of the commodities, actually features into your ratings?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of these things already feature into the ratings as long as they have a material impact on capacity and willingness of debt repayment. And I think that's a very important concept that we've been talking and we've been engaging with many stakeholders, which is, understand what this product, what a rating is, and also what is not, right? So you could understand, especially, for example, thinking about governments, right? I mean, there are many governments that could be doing a fair amount of investment on adaptation, but they could go through a foreign exchange crisis, and that's going to weaken their capacity of repaying debt. So if I have to tell investors what's the likelihood of debt repayment, I had to pay attention to your investments on all these issues, but I also had to be able to determine how material they are, on capacity of debt repayment. So can we do a better job maybe dissecting it a little bit better so people can see it better in the outcome product? Maybe that's something that we are definitely thinking about it. What I think, especially from the governments and sovereigns perspective, that there is a big change in ratings coming because this is going to be incorporated, I wouldn't think so. I think in some cases, you might have maybe a little bit of difference. What there will be more understanding on where it's heavier or more material in the actual outcome. That is something we could definitely work on, and we are already trying to incorporate that where we see it fit. For example, we do comment a fair amount of this on countries. We very recently we produced 3 rounds already of a report called Lost GDP risk, and basically we look at, through geospatial analysis, we look at exposure to drought, heat waves, water stress, and flooding across the world, and we highlighted which parts of the world are more exposed. We also combine that with the degree of institutional assessment that we have in order to provide, so if you're highly exposed but you have a high degree of institutional strength, that means that most likely your adaptation and your mitigation is a little bit better. And we created a heat map on that where we show for people to look at through 3 different scenarios of global warming coming up, where we saw which parts of the world, and actually we listed all the countries, are more exposed. So this is type of analysis that we're trying to do to provide more transparency, where people can see where, even though you might have, for example, the Philippines, where you might have an investment grade rating, you do see that you also have one of the largest exposure to flood in the world. So when you're an investor, these are all things, information that you had to bring in order to make your decisions.
If I can wear the Mercer Investments hat, back to sort of the blockchain and transparency. I mean, to me, I think that's the most exciting thing. Really, it's going to impact investing. I think the ability for investors to actually trace where their investments are coming from, the journeys that they've taken, I think is so powerful and will allow so many people comfort where they haven't been investing in this space because they haven't had that view that I think now is becoming more common.
You still get a question, I'm afraid. So you gave a really compelling narrative around productivity and that it was good business to take care of your people. Do you have any data? Are there data points out there that show that that a healthy, resilient workforce provides a better return to shareholders?
Yeah, so we have a report that's coming out. Not,
Oh, hang on, this wasn't supposed to be a plug, but I'm so pleased that it is. Carry on.
but it's not ready. So you're gonna have to wait for the next COP, I think. But yeah, they're actually we have a lot of data on that. So we happen to be the world's largest HR consultant. So we've got data on well over 100 million employees around the globe, and tracing people's absenteeism is surprisingly easy to do. So yes, we do have that, but not as of yet to be released.
To be continued. Rob, I saw you go for your mic before I tackled Cara, so please. Okay. I'd like to give the opportunity to the audience if you have any questions. Very happy to take any questions. If not, I will keep going.
I'll go back to the point that I was going to make then, and it's that you were saying about if investors knew where to invest on the positive side. I think the other side of it is where are they already investing, and especially when it comes to deforestation, the financial flows that are going into activities that encourage deforestation are still way too high. And this has been something we've been talking about for 15 years now. And I do feel like the investment community, there's one thing, there's many things they could do to put their house in order, as indeed we can too. But I think looking at where your money is going and where it's doing damage with greater transparency, to your point, it's not just where stuff comes from, it's where it's going to.
Maybe if I may, on that point, I mean, I think deforestation, for example, is one of these issues that I was trying to highlight on. How do governments can cope with that, right? Many years ago, I was in Brazil, and we were talking precisely. There was a free trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union that fell through because of deforestation issues in Brazil, which since now has gotten a lot better. But at that point, it's an issue of alternatives, right? So a lot of people that are investing in deforestation, as Rob was saying, what do they do? I mean, these are close to 1 million people that live out of that deforestation and planting soybeans, etc. So what alternatives do this? So this issue, governments had to come up with alternatives. So you say, okay, well, let's not deforest. So what do we do with the people that are living out of that? These are things that they had to be part of a much broader, which I think it is now. It wasn't when the issue came up, and I think now there is a lot more of discussions around it. I'm not sure the solution is quite there yet, but it's very important that we keep those alternatives in mind.
So if I come back to the point of transparency and disclosure, there are a number of disclosure regimes around the world, ISSB being probably the most prevalent, which is actually fairly light on specifics around resilience. CSRD and CSDDD will change that. Rob, to what extent do you think the fact that sunlight is the best disinfectant, do you think that we will have better resilience outcomes if we had better resilience disclosure frameworks?
That's a leading question. I think in the case of CSRD, it's still too early to say exactly how this will shake down. We're living right now through the process of transitioning what was a GRI, strongly GRI compliant voluntary report, best in class, to something that becomes compliant with regulation. And speaking as a practitioner, I welcome the transparency that CSRD brings. I'm concerned that in the near term at least, the amount of effort that it's taking to fully comply with CSRD is unquestionably diverting resources away from action. That may be temporary, and in which case it just becomes a cost of doing business and we all get over it and move on in 3 or 4 years' time. If that doesn't happen, then there's a fundamental problem. Point one. Point two, I think we're going to take at least 3 or 4 years to understand not just how issuers are going about meeting the regulations, but then it becomes about how the investment community and the ratings agencies use all that data. knowing what I know, I think there is a possibility that, rather in the same way as in the old days with an annual report, the financial world, the analysts would cut out all the narrative at the front and just use the pages at the back where the numbers were, that there might be a degree of that goes on with CSRD. Oh, that bit of it's not relevant, that bit's not. So we might be putting a lot of effort into things that actually don't get fully examined to the level that maybe was the original intention. I also think that there is a problem around storytelling. I think a lot of what we need to do in this space is around storytelling. And so we're now looking at completely reinventing how we communicate this. Again, temporary, we'll get over that, we'll move on. Overall, net, I think ISSB convergence around the world in terms of platforms and standards is a totally welcome thing. We really would be very, very happy if there was a lot more transparency. To your point about free riders earlier on, we want to see more. We are interested, shall we say, as players in the game on CSRD as to how. We're not clear yet on how it will shake down. But I think we have to embrace it, we have to welcome it, because it's a massive step forward in terms of the regulatory regime around reporting on sustainability.
I can't remember who I should be crediting to this, but just as Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, I heard storytelling eats data for breakfast, and I think we all need to get far better at it because the data hasn't landed, so storytelling's the way ahead. I'd like to thank my panel hugely for your thoughts on resilience. It feels to me as if there isn't enough penalty for the free riders to stimulate the actors that want to be moving the dial faster to really justify that action to shareholders. And so great to hear that regulators want to resolve that dysfunction. So thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts, and thank you to our audience.